Let's begin with the 1949 fiscal year budget. Due to tensions in Europe with the Berlin airlift, the military sees a small growth in their budget. However, Truman limits the use of this money and tries to keep it as low as possible. The budget would be set for $3.7 billion and be offset by the last of the Naval Fund, which is $25 million. The fleet lost several key vessels. It dropped its carrier strength by 1 to a total of 8 active carriers, a loss of 2 light carriers, 13 light cruisers, and numerous auxiliary ships. Also cut were a number of land-based patrol squadrons. The budget would aim for 500,000 personnel, but the Navy would only be able to maintain 450,000 through the 1949 budget year. Key that year was that it would be the last year the Navy could draw from its surplus war stocks, specifically stored aircraft. If the Navy budget for the 1950 fiscal year did not greatly increase to procure new equipment and aircraft, the Navy would see itself be reduced by a third of its size by 1950. Key in this year's budget was the cancellation of 12 ships under construction and a number of ships receiving upgrades. With this money, the Navy would save $200 million, which would be used for the Navy to begin construction on their future, a supercarrier called the USS United States. 1949. 4 years after World War II and 1 year before the Korean War, many important things take place this year for the Navy. In 1949, the Berlin airlift was in full force as tension increased around the world that brought about military buildup in the U.S. It will be seen, however, the greatest conflict for the Navy this year was not the global tensions, but conflict within America against the other military branches. January 7th, George Marshall resigns as Secretary of State due to ill health. Several days later, Dean Acheson would be sworn in as the 51st Secretary of State. Acheson would direct America in dealing with Soviet aggression and lead U.S. foreign policy into the Korean War. On March 28th, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, from overexhaustion, stress from his position, and eventual demise in his mental health, was forced to resign his position. To replace him as the new Secretary of Defense, Truman would appoint Louis Johnson, who helped him in his re-election. Truman was constantly frustrated with Forrestal for his failure to unite the military branches, not cutting the military's budget enough. In appointing Johnson, Truman gave him 2 objectives: drastically cut the defense budget and unify the services. Although not an easy job, Johnson would focus all his energy on these 2 tasks. More of an Air Force guy, Johnson would put his crosshairs on the U.S. Navy. On April 4th, after several months of negotiation, NATO was formed with 12 founding members and tasked with the mutual defense of Europe. The U.S. Navy would spend much of its year organizing itself within NATO structure. April 23rd, just 5 days after the construction began on the USS United States, Secretary of Defense Johnson outright canceled it. With support of the Air Force and Army, Johnson argued that the Navy's supercarrier was redundant to the Air Force's bomber force and was a waste of the federal budget. Refusing to give back the money reserved for the construction of the carrier, Johnson declared after only a month of being on the job, he had already saved the taxpayer $200 million. The future of naval aviation was in jeopardy. This would set in motion a series of events that would culminate in the following months. On April 29th, just 6 days after the cancellation of the Navy's supercarrier, Secretary of the Navy John Sullivan resigned in protest. After 323 days of airlift, the Soviet blockade of West Berlin was lifted and the airlift ended on May 12th. Tensions are high in Europe, but the West sees victory with the Berlin airlift. On May 25th, Francis Matthews was appointed as the 50th Secretary of the Navy. Matthews was another important figure raising money for Truman during his re-election. With limited understanding of national defense issues and a near non-existent understanding or familiarity with either the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Marine Corps, Matthews admitted to never having set foot on board a floating vessel larger than a rowboat. This earned him the name Rowboat Matthews among naval personnel. On July 9th, Navy and Army transport and supply ships come together to form the Military Sea Transport Service. This is the precursor of the Sea Mobility Command today. With the cancellation of the United States, the tension between the Air Force and the Navy come to a head in what was dubbed the Revolt of the Admirals. Congressional hearings occurred in August and October after a document was leaked to Congress calling into question the Air Force B-36 program. Episode 11 of the Navy Interwar series walks through this in depth. On August 10th, Truman signed an amendment to the National Security Act of 1947, which renames the National Military Establishment the Department of Defense and gives more power to the Secretary of Defense by absorbing the 3 cabinet-level military departments. On August 29th, to the shock of the world, the USSR tests their first atomic bomb, 8 years before expected. This eliminates America's monopoly of atomic warfare. In September, after 3 years of fighting, the Greek Civil War finally comes to an end. From September 20th through November 25th, the biggest amphibious operation between World War II and the Korean War occurred on the beaches of Hawaii. Operation Miki. This Navy-Army operation consisted of the entire 2nd Infantry Division coming ashore from 40 major amphibious ships and escorted by 2 carrier divisions. This would be the largest amphibious operation after World War II until the landings of Incheon during the Korean War. 3 days later, on October 1st, the Chinese Civil War ended with the Communists forming the People's Republic of China and the Nationalists retreating to the island of Taiwan. On October 27th, after being promised he would receive no penalty for testifying before Congress, Admiral Louis Denfeld was relieved of command of CNO of the Navy for his part in the Revolt of the Admiral hearings. He was replaced on November 2nd by Admiral Forrest Sherman. Click here for the next episode of the series. Make sure to subscribe, like, and hit the bell button. This is U.S. Military History.